I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a 2020 straight-to-Netflix movie directed by Charlie Kaufman, and it was kind of an amazing yet hypnotizing experience. This is not your typical film, but if you know who Charlie Kaufman is, then you should expect nothing less than to be utterly confused on your first watch. That's not to say he intentionally crafts his films to be confusing or misinterpreted. It just means he's a very clever and profound filmmaker that doesn't like to hold your hand while you watch it. There's a dark mystery going on behind everything, and the filmmaker doesn't spoon-feed the answer to the audience. In fact, this is one that needs to be viewed twice in order to really understand it. Don't let that statement frighten you. I've seen the movie 3 times now, not because I needed to understand it, but because I genuinely loved the film. It just so happened that upon each subsequent viewing, it became immensely more clear what Kaufman was trying to convey. Therefore, it got better and better each time I watched it. And who knows, maybe on a 4th watch I'll pick up on even more and love it even more. Unfortunately, not everyone who saw this movie had the same experience that I did. And I can imagine someone disliking the movie, but only because they didn't understand it. If this is how you felt while watching the movie, then you must not know who Charlie Kaufman is. His movies are metaphors. When turning on a movie by Charlie Kaufman, you need to automatically understand that not everything you see is literal. Some scenes could be entirely taking place in someone's head. You never know. But don't let a lack of understanding on your part devalue this work of art. Instead, let me explain what I interpreted from this movie and maybe give it a rewatch afterwards. See if it changed your perspective at all. With that said, from here on out there will be spoilers, so if you haven't seen it, skip to this part of the video right now. Are you gone yet? Okay, let's get started. The first thing you need to understand is that pretty much the entire movie is happening inside the mind of this old man. The only scenes that are really happening in the world are the scenes with him. The main portion of the film with Jake is just a fantasy. This is a fantasy that the old man is having. You see, the old man and Jake are the same person. This is made apparent in the shot of the old man looking out the window, and in the next shot it's Jesse Plemons. Also, there are little instances throughout where Jake will appear old for a brief second, or suddenly his radio will turn into the old man's. This aspect was something I caught onto on my first watch. What I didn't immediately get was why the story was being told from the perspective of this woman. She's clearly the main character of the movie. Well, a big thing you need to understand is that the old man hates himself. This is made abundantly clear in some scenes that we'll discuss here in a little bit, but for now, just know that he hates himself so much that he can't even put himself as the main character of his own fantasy. Instead, his fantasy is from the perspective of a woman who doesn't even want to be with him. You've got to remember that everyone in this fantasy is old Jake's version of that person. So when she starts talking about suicide or something that he doesn't want in his fantasy, it'll be interrupted. Could this be because the old man hates himself so much he wants to kill himself, and maybe the fantasy is supposed to be a distraction from that? This also leads me to believe that the title has 2 meanings. She's thinking of ending things with him, while he's thinking of ending things for good. I believe that the snowy weather and constant cold environments represents his hatred and cold attitude towards himself, and also maybe his parents, who were definitely my favorite characters of the whole movie. When we arrive at their house, Jake refuses to confront his parents immediately, and it takes a while for them to be introduced. This could be just the fact that the old man isn't ready for his fantasy to be tainted by unpleasant memories of his parents. It's clear that he has a hatred towards them as well, because he's constantly aggravated when they speak, and he lashes out at them for small things. I do believe this hatred developed because he clearly feels like he wasted his life taking care of them. There's this basement in his parents' house that he refuses to let the girl into, and it's in here that she finds old talents like his paintings and stuff. This angers Jake, which told me that he wants to hide these worthless talents deep in his brain, but his subconscious won't let him. He could have used these talents to be someone, but instead he wasted his life taking care of his parents. The reason that they appear in his fantasy at all is probably because he wants to imagine something that really could have happened. This woman has 3 different majors, multiple jobs, and her name changes from scene to scene. Jake is simply fantasizing about all different possibilities because, as we learn later, Jake never even knew this woman. She's someone that he saw at a bar once, and he's putting her in all these different scenarios and imagining how his parents would react to it. Their reaction is almost always negative or unconvincingly positive. The reason I believe his parents to be so weird is because this fantasy is an exaggeration of how he sees them. Even in real life, everyone views everyone differently. You could be an entirely different person in one person's eyes than another. What we're seeing in this movie is not how these characters really are, but how they are in Jake's eyes. I've never seen a movie told in that perspective before, but it's brilliant. When they leave the parents' house, they decide to pull over and get snow cones even though it's snowing. This is just more cold symbolism if you ask me. At this snow cone hut, 3 girls are working. These are the same girls that we saw earlier in the school. The bashful looking girl is really sweet, but the other 2 ones were the ones that were making fun of old Jake. And the reason that young Jake refuses to approach them is because he's literally afraid of being mocked. The bashful girl tells the main character something along the lines of, "We can stay here. We don't have to keep moving." This is Jake's subconscious telling him not to keep moving forward in this fantasy, because he knows deep down that it will end in his suicide. We also get this scene of old Jake watching a movie. This is not a real movie. This scene was actually created for this movie. Keep the actors in your mind. It's clear old Jake is seeing himself in these characters. Young Jake and the main character arrive at the high school. It's at this point where Jake feels his first sexual desire towards this woman. It's interrupted immediately by Jake saying there's a pervert watching. Obviously, there's not really anyone there. He's referring to himself. He hates himself so much that he won't even allow his fantasies to get the least bit sexual. After Jake leaves to go after this pervert, the main woman sits in the car talking to herself about how hypothermia would be an ideal way to kill yourself. Keep in mind, this is still old Jake's thoughts. It's just being portrayed to us through this character. She throws away her snow cone cup in a trash can full of these cups. This part tells me that he's had this fantasy many times. Inside the school, she meets old Jake. She tells him she can't even remember Jake's face and that she never even knew him. This is where it's revealed to us that she was a girl he once saw in a bar, and she talks about how she thought he was a creep. We don't really know if this girl thinks Jake was a creep. This is just how Jake imagines she would have felt. As she leaves, the actors from the movie that old Jake was watching earlier replace the real actors, and they perform a dance number in the hallway. This dance number is from Philadelphia, a musical that Jake has expressed love for earlier in the movie. It's also the musical that the high school he works at is currently performing. There are a couple of scenes in the real world where he's shown watching the students perform dances from Philadelphia. They think that he's creepy for staring, but really, it just means a lot to him. The dance number turns into a fight scene where he places a janitor as the bad guy. Of course he puts himself as the bad guy. In the scene, he's fighting himself. This is his self-hatred in the forefront, and it begins snowing inside the gymnasium. This is the most obvious use of the cold, snowy weather to represent his cold, bitter hatred towards himself. Once Jake kills Jake, we go back to the old man who has made the decision to end things. He sits in his car, giving himself hypothermia. The reason he takes all of his clothes off and hallucinates is because those are actual things that happen to you when you get hypothermia. No symbolism there, it's just what hypothermia is really like. Before it ends, we get to see this scene of young Jake with like old person makeup on. This is my only flaw with the movie because it's almost identical to the ending of A Beautiful Mind. This is definitely intentional because you can see A Beautiful Mind in Jake's room earlier in the movie. Clearly they're trying to reference it here, but it feels more like a ripoff to me. It's just that the whole movie was this completely original masterpiece, and then the ending is something exactly like another movie that I've already seen. It just didn't sit right with me. But then we cut to the gorgeous closing shot of the truck covered in snow. Is Jake in there? We'll never know, but I think he is. I think his self-hatred overpowered him and he ended things. And that, my friends, is my interpretation of what I'm thinking of ending things means. Very unique, incredible movie. Charlie Kaufman is one of my favorite directors, and he once again blew me away. Hopefully I gave you something to think about, because this really is one of those movies that needs to be analyzed and discussed. If you've seen it once, I beg you to rewatch it with these things in your mind. Every line of dialogue is important, and there's plenty that I didn't discuss for you to pick up on yourself. And who knows, maybe my interpretation is wrong. But I'm pretty sure I got it down, and even if it is wrong, that's the beautiful thing about Charlie Kaufman's movies, is they can be interpreted in different ways. I'm thinking of Ending Things as my favorite film of 2020 so far, and I can't recommend it enough. And I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10.